Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. This talk is going to be really rather different from the other plenaries. I'm not going to be talking about my own work, except maybe for half a minute. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about IEL. Before we start, I would really like all of us to thank the organizers of this conference, Christian Meyer and Bernd Kautmann and their team, for fabulous arrangements. We are making history, as Tartu Navalainen said, and we're making history in a much bigger splash than I think anybody anticipated, which has produced a great deal more work for the organizers than they ever imagined. IEL and this conference represent the fruits of discussion that started several years ago about ways in which the various aspects of research on English language and linguistics could be brought together. There are international conferences on synchronic English linguistics, on historical English linguistics, and more local conferences on corpora, on varieties of English, but no one context in which all of these would be discussed together. The Directions in English Language Studies DELS conference in Manchester in 2006 was a pilot project to see how much interest there might be in a society that aimed to bring all these perspectives together. And the enthusiastic and positive response there at DELS, which was organized by David Dennison and Richard Hogg, led to the formation of a working party to bring into being a society that would promote English language and linguistics, especially the study of the structure and history of standard and non-standard varieties of English in terms of both form and function at an international level. I put it on a slide along with the Constitution's language. For those of you who care about variety and stylistic differences, you can spend a little time thinking about that. But the key points are the same: English language and linguistics, form and function, synchrony and diachrony, standard and non-standard varieties. And I would like to say, because I think there's been some misunderstanding about this, that at least as far as we conceptualized it, IEL replaces DELS and DELS only and is complementary to all the other conferences that both have occurred in the past and will no doubt occur in the future. The first objective was to get a conference organized and an executive committee elected who would prepare a draft constitution, and we all owe the working party great thanks for their energy. Thanks also to the nominating committee for their nominations and to you for your votes. A major conceptualizing force from the beginning was the late Richard Hogg, and as you know, a Richard Hogg Prize was initiated in his memory associated with IEL. Has been awarded to Rona Alcorn. David Dennison, your immediately future president, helped put the finances and criteria for the prize together. And thanks to Tartu Navalainen for chairing the prize committee. Keep the submissions coming. You'll hear more about that at the business meeting on Friday. The main item at the business meeting will be voting on the Constitution. For several months, a draft constitution was up on the IEL website for comment, and the resulting document is on the conference website and in your folders. And I hope you will take time to look at it before Friday's meeting. Bring a copy with you. Everyone who is registered at this conference is entitled to vote. And if you have any last-minute amendments, please give them to Graham Trousdale by 4 p.m. tomorrow, Thursday. Graham, Maybe you want to stand up so that you can identify Graham Trousdale if you want to give him an amendment by tomorrow. Your executive committee who helped to get IEL off the ground are Bas Arts, Vice President for the profession, Jean Atchison, Vice President for teaching, David Dennison, President-elect, he'll take over at the end of this conference, Tertu Neverleinen, Vice President for research, Graham Trousdale, Secretary, and Patrick Honeybone, Webmaster, and myself. I especially want to thank Patrick Honeybone for making the website work. There will be more to hear about that on Friday. But most especially, I want to thank Graham Trousdale for endless work, keeping lists of provisional members, fielding proposed amendments to the Constitution, conducting elections, keeping minutes of focus groups, and many, many other tasks. Now to my topic. Christian Meyer and Bernd Kortmann asked me to speak about where I think English language and linguistic studies are and where they're going. In talking about this issue, I have the objectives of IEL in mind, also the workshops at this conference, and research here at Freiburg. Of course, I have to be selective. There is a handout. I made great efforts to make it happen in 2 pieces of paper, knowing that Freiburg is a green city, but somehow it ended up on 3 pieces of paper. Anyway, the handout is there primarily for references and so forth, and it isn't even the whole set that I will use. Now, I don't think we can do any work whatsoever without resources. So I'm assuming resources as I talk about the various areas of research that I think are important. Let's start out with some tomes. You may have other tomes in mind, but these fit on the slide. 1990, I'm thinking of the last 10 years or so. 1999, Biber et al., 2002, Huddleston and Pullum, 2004, Kortmann and Schneider, and 2006 was a real bumper year. Artson, McMahon, Hogg, Dennison, and Mugglestone. And of course, none of that work would have been possible without what I think in many ways changed the way in which people do linguistics these days, which is the advent of corpora. I've only listed a few there. The ones with F, of course, are related to work here in Freiburg. The fruits of these corpora include work on color structures like Gries and Stefanovic has done, Martin Hilpert, who's done it diachronically. It says forthcoming, but in fact it has forthcoming. I saw it on the Benjamin's table today. It's just come out. Christian Meyer's work on the history of English in the 20th century, and there's been a workshop all day long. Leach and Arts and Meyer and many others working on current developments in history of English. And of course, there are our dictionaries and resource materials. Now, I'm just assuming those as the kinds of resources that we depend on. I want to think about 3 promontories: theoretical linguistics, usage-based models, and English as a global language. Promontory is my metaphor because there are paths to it, there are paths from it, and you can look out to vast vistas and imagine things that you hope will come into being. And as I think about these promontories, there will be some cross-current some cross-reference to recurrent themes, contrastive comparative work, issues of gradients, gradualness, and relating micro to macro structures. So let's start with promontory 1, paths to it and from it. I think it's a truism these days that much of the 20th century theoretical linguistics, certainly from the 1950s on, if you think of work of Firth and Halliday in the UK, and you think of Chomsky and Labov in the US, around the 1950s, theoretical linguistics, in some sense, not only was written in English, but was based on English. And as a result of this, theoretical linguistics and English linguistics, in many senses, came to be somewhat the same thing. So English linguistics is a widely practiced field of research, though not always an administrative entity. But there are problems with this. As you all know, standard and constructed scripted English is typologically odd with respect to the languages of Europe and other varieties of English, as Cartman in the Arts and McMahon book that I cited have pointed out. And so there's a little bit of a paradox here. As Arts and McMahon rather cutely say, when referring to Chomsky, Halley, and Labov, influence from these works has spread to inspire descriptions and theoretical analyses of other languages. At least in some cases, it seems that English linguistics sneezes and general linguistics catches cold. So the importance of English linguistics has been enormous because it has influenced theoretical linguistics around the world, and it has influenced theoretical linguistics as it is applied to languages such as Japanese and such as Ewe, all around the world. But it may be that theoretical generalizations based on English can be misleading just because English is typologically somewhat odd. And to rectify this problem, there's been a great deal of work, primarily, I would say, in Europe rather than in the US, on contrastive and comparative linguistics. I've listed a few things there. Most particularly, I draw attention to the Eurotype volumes. It started to come out in 1995, 8 of 9 volumes so far. And WALS, the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures, which reveals the typological relationship of languages to each other. And if we start from English, the typological relationship of English not only to Celtic and Germanic and European languages, but also to world languages. And looking at that, I found it quite fascinating, having been brought up, so to speak, with the Keenan-Cunby hierarchy of relativization and relative markers, to find that the relative pronoun on the subject is a European feature. In fact, it's not in Indo-European outside of Europe. And for an English speaker like myself, it seems awfully obvious that one would have a distinction between a reflexive and a reciprocal, because we have self and each other. But if we look at how that plays itself out in the languages of Europe, we will find it is extremely odd in Europe. Because in Europe, it's only in English, and in none of its cognate languages. It's there in Europe in English, Basque, and Finnish, though it is quite frequent in the rest of the world. So that just gives us a little bit of sense of the way in which English needs to be relativized against the other languages of the world typologically. When we relativize it that way and we think about its typological relationship to other languages of the world, we necessarily are going to think about variation. And variation is no longer the purview primarily of sociolinguistics. There's been a turn to variation in UG-based generative models, the work on microparameters in the cartography of languages that Cinque and Kane are engaged in. Think about variation, fine-grained variation among languages. So does work on optimality theory. And when we think about those kinds of phenomena and variation and microparameters and micro differences, we're necessarily going to think about continua. And here we have issues coming up of gradients, which I take to be a synchronic phenomenon, and gradualness, which I take to be a diachronic phenomenon, and how they interact. There's been quite a lot of discussion of category gradients. Very famously, there's this phrase, very fun. That's very fun. And when you think about very fun, you think, well, maybe something strange is happening to the noun fun. How good a noun is fun in that context. But then you come across things like, that's pretty fun, or a wonderful example I found in the New York Times, the quotation about some dubious construction going on in Iraq. That was pretty cowboy, where you have pretty as an adjective. No. Is it an adverb? So we have questions here about the categorial status of nouns. We have questions about the categorial status of certain adjectives, but they're always in context with each other, of course, not out of context. So there's a lot of discussion of continua and gradients, how they got there gradually over time. And there's also a lot of discussion going on about subsystem gradients, the grammatical lexical continuum. Laurel Brinton has written quite extensively on these complex predicates like give someone an answer. And give someone an answer is generally telic and very productive, and she suggests it's highly grammaticalized. It seems reasonable. But of course, it's a whole construction that's grammaticalized or constructionalized. Graham Trousdale has looked at a very similar looking one, give X a roasting. Now, the ing there, gerund, progressive, makes that whole construction atelic as opposed to the other one, which is telic. But because it's atelic, it's aspectual, so it's grammatical to some extent. However, it's very lexical as well, because almost all the constructions in which this occurs, you will find that the verb does not mean its literal meaning. That's nothing about roasting. That's criticizing. It's metalinguistic. They're almost all metalinguistic, like give someone a dressing down. You're not unclothing them. You are criticizing them, right? This is a metalinguistic thing. So what we have here is a subsystem gradients. And I've been hearing quite a lot about those kinds of things today, and I see they're on your program. So in sum, in theoretical English linguistics, there's been a turn. I would say primarily in Europe to comparison everywhere to variation, interest in typological differences in subsystems, differences between subsystems, generally across languages, and then between subsystems of the same language, give someone an answer and give someone a roasting as examples of that. So moving on rapidly, paths to and from promontory to usage-based models. I think there's been a major shift in the last 20 years or so, but it's become, it's a huge S-curve and a very extensive shift these days to usage-based models, though they're very different sorts. Cognitive grammar describes itself as usage-based because it is thinking about language from the perspective of communicative and interactive ways of thinking about language and the function of language. And construction grammar, for the most part, says of itself that it is usage-based. And Goldberg, most recently in her 2006 book, has talked about the importance of looking at frequencies and individual patterns. But I will notice that those particular kinds of models that call themselves usage-based are actually almost always full of examples that are constructed or scripted. So in that sense, they're not usage-based. They're usage-based in the sense that they concern communication, that they are not thinking of universal grammar as, in some sense, a separate model that is internal. But in some sense, they're not usage-based. So my third one on this slide, interactional linguistics, is where you need to go to think about usage-based models that are focused on actual language use, spoken and written. And here we're thinking of conversational analysis, turn-taking, rhetorical strategies. And the minute you start thinking about those kinds of issues, then you will find that the sorts of data you're looking at are fundamentally different from the kinds of data that you're looking at if you're doing standard generative theoretical linguistics, or if you're doing cognitive linguistics, or indeed if you're doing many kinds of construction grammar. Your text types are going to be quite widespread, wide-ranging, and I've heard today in the workshop on changes in the history of 20th century or even 21st century English, presentations based on corpus data where you will find all kinds of textual data. I have here trials, parliamentary records, department meetings, medical texts, recipes, service encounters, blogs, film, whatever your particular text type is. So one of the, I think, fundamental changes that has happened is the extraordinary spread and expansion of text types that has occurred because of the corpora that are available. And it's not just a study of text types, but also there's been a major shift now back to, I would say back to, interest in stylistics. It was something that was very prominent in the sort of 1960s, and then for the most part disappeared from theoretical work, and I think has come back again because of the work that is being done on corpora and also genre analysis. That used to be the domain primarily of people in literature departments, but now it has become very much the domain of at least some people working in linguistics. And here in Freiburg, Monika Frudenick, back in 1996, in a study of narratology, wrote a book about the study of the conceptualization of criminality and prisons through narrative, and I know that that's an ongoing project. This raises questions like, how do genres change over time? What does this tell us about changes we observe? A topic that came up frequently today was, how do we think about the effects of colloquialization of writing? I was given a very interesting book about the development of causals in English and in Japanese. And in this book, there was a very strong claim that it was very clear that the normal grammaticalization process from relatively loose parotactic structure to something much more embedded and subordinated was counter-exemplified by the history of both languages, English and Japanese, because in the 18th, 19th centuries, you start to get much more parotactic kinds of constructions, and you, in fact, just get causal clauses. So you would have a dialogue, and someone would say, why did you do that? And then someone would answer, because X. Now, the question I immediately had, and I think it was one that is going to resonate here, is, now, are we talking about change in structure? Are we talking about change in grammar, since the embedded structure, subordinated structure is still around? Or are we actually talking about a change in style? Are we actually talking about a change in how people practice writing? I leave that as an open question. I happen to think it's the latter, but many here are studying questions like that. And as we think about these things, I think we have to think about context. And again, there's a significant change that's happened, I think, in the last 20 years or so about how we think about context. That goes parallel with all these other phenomena that I've been talking about. It was standard, and is still standard, to think of a minimal local context, which is the phrase or the clause. So if you want to distinguish various uses of modals, you can note that I can do that is ability, and you can do that is ability or permission. And then in something that I have been spending some part of my life with recently, all and what pseudoclefs, if it comes in them, all you can get is ability. All I or you can do is to avoid common mistakes, can only be ability, it's not going to be permission. But of course, if you go beyond that, and you look at the larger linguistic discourse context, including genre, you'll find that the original statement, I can do that is ability, no longer holds, because I can do that is perfectly good as permission in the context of rules and regulations. And I've become particularly interested in what has been called dialogic or contesting contexts as the triggers for the development of all kinds of things in language. It's very clearly there in the development of what has come to be known as the Jespersen cycle. It's there in the development of not out of Nacht. It was the double marked negative. It's there in the textual evidence of the development of the famous French ne pas tu pas. It's there in the development of adversative connectives like instead and albeit. And it's there in the development of the pseudoclefts. And to illustrate what I mean by contesting context, there's an example. The structure I'm looking at is all I could do was to order some soldiers that went for France to call at Charleville. And in the old days, like 20, 25 years ago, I would probably only have looked at that. I would look at it as a sentence. I would have looked at it in its own internal local context. I might have thought there were some interesting things to say about the use of could in there. It's really very important in the development of this construction. But what I'm doing now is looking back at prior context. And it is very clear when you look at all the examples historically of the emergence of this particular construction, the all pseudocleft. Every single example is preceded by, it wasn't this, but it was that. And look at this one. There was no possibility of my leaving the army. I never could obtain leave, but remained most of the winter there. And it goes on, continues with its contesting context. And one of the interesting things about it is if you look at modern examples in present-day English, they're still primarily there in contesting contexts. So old contexts continue to be used over time, but they come not to be necessary anymore. They become optional, and that's part of the development of this new construction. So I think we need to be very careful about our arguments about function. People often say, the function of X is such and such. Ellen Prince, back in 1978, and in many other people, including herself, many subsequent publications have said that the pseudocleft is information structuring. All I want to do is X. All I want to do is go and get that wine this evening, right? Right afterwards. Paul Hoppert, however, says what this is for, why do we have these things? It's for claiming the floor in turn-taking. I think both of them are right, because information structuring is part of a kind of monologic speech, the example that I just gave you. That's the information structuring. But the strategic turn claiming is when you use it in conversation. So we have to be very careful, think about our contextual information. When we do our corpus work, we always need to keep in mind what is available, surely, there in the corpus. Information, what precedes, what follows, what is the genre, what is the speaker, and many other things. In other words, pay attention to context. Not only the local context, not only the prior context, but of course the larger ideological discourse context, which may include issues of contact, nationalism, and prescriptivism. At one point, you may have seen that Anna Wielzbicka had been going to be present and give a presentation. I'm sure if she had come, she would have talked about the cultural constructs that go into meanings like fair and reasonable, or warned that I think, which so many of us have looked at in modern English, in fact functions extremely differently from the way it functioned in the 16th and the 17th century when it was much more assertive. So we can find the same words, but do not assume they mean the same thing across time, across Englishes, or even across text types. So what all this summarizes as, I think, is that detailed microanalysis needs to be integrated with macrostructural analysis. And Stockwell, in talking about cognitive poetics, said precisely that. Detailed analysis at the microlinguistic level is integrated with a broader view of the communicative context. And of course, we must not forget that it's impossible to be ideologically neutral in our theory, our corpus, our dictionary, or our grammar. In these usage-based models, there's been a turn to naturally occurring speech and writing. There's been a turn to attention to larger contexts, beyond the local ones, to discourse, social, and ideological contexts, and micro-macro integration. Now, very briefly, a look at promontory 3, globalization, spread of English. That map there from David Crystal, 1995, is old, but it tells us something important. It tells us that there are basically two types of English. We all know that. It tells us that the spread of English is not only based on colonialization patterns. You see with the languages where, the parts of the world where English as a second language or as a variety of English is spoken tends to correlate with colonialization patterns. But you will also notice that there's a strong correlation with trade routes. Now, the study of the globalization of English, as far as I see it, started out with studies of pidgins and creoles, thinking here of the work of Bickerton and Rickford, the look at varieties of English that developed in particular historical circumstances. And since then, there's been a turn to study of second language varieties and national Englishes around the world, represented by the Kortmann and Schneider 2004, now paperback 2008 volumes, the comparative cross-dialectal and cross-linguistic point of view. And I think of special theoretical interest here is what is the effect of contact, both linguistic and social contact. And another theoretical question that many people are puzzling over is the paradox of the fact that English is morphologically fairly simple, but so idiomatic that it is very context dependent and enormously complex. And if you think of look up, look down on, look over, overlook, you can add to those endlessly, right? Just the use of these little particles and prepositions and how they work, which is enormously complicated for non-native speakers of English to understand. So the English may look morphologically awfully simple, but it is very complex at another level. So what is complexity? That, I think, is a major theme that a lot of people here and elsewhere are thinking about. I know there's or has been, a workshop on Anglo-versals, which has been a project at Freiburg. Those are special universals that seem to arise independent of various historical and other contexts in which one might imagine that they occurred. Are there vernacular universals? Well, that's a new term, right? There's also, of course, been enormous interest in the fact that for the first time, we have a globalization process that is happening in real time. Spanish and Portuguese were widely spread languages many centuries ago, but of course we have no direct access to them, nor do we have direct access to globalization of Latin, Sanskrit, and various other languages. So is there something special about English? Is there something special about English that is actually, in its spread, making the crystal 1995 Matt outdated? He's here, so he can answer that question. Probably is going to talk about it. But I think there is a question when we think about the fact that English is now spread by the media, internet, the global economy, for better or for worse, very worse in the last few weeks, global travel, and the various other kinds of global phenomena that are leading, have led to the spread of English. Not that English is necessarily very well known by the speakers who use it, but nevertheless, as David Crystal said in the 2006 article that I refer to here, about 25% of the population of the world apparently has some access, at least minimal access, to some kind of probably quite limited English, limited not only in the extent of the amount of English that's available, but limited to the actual text type in which it is used. So he has raised the question for us to think about, does this suggest, because of the unprecedented media, global economy, global travel, that we have different globalization patterns from those that we've had before? One thing I think we can be fairly sure of that is not going to be different is that geopolitical shifts may bring radical changes, sometimes in a big hurry. So that was sort of my three promontories, very rapid, just skating across a huge number of, I think, really important research areas that have been developing and I suspect will continue to develop. I looked at theoretical linguistics, usage-based grammars, globalization of English, and I think that this suggests some responsibilities for us as individual researchers and for IEL as an organization. So our responsibilities to research. These include contextualizing Englishes among the languages of the world. That was my beginning topic, the comparative work. Documenting dying and emerging Englishes, which is part of the study of varieties of English around the world. We have a vice president for research, Terttu Neuvalainen, and that job is to help, ambitious jobs these are, but help English language and linguistics researchers and teachers to support existing work and promote new topics to include in their home institutions and conferences. I think this conference is really showing what has been going on for a long time. There's always a change. I know I'm a historical linguist, but I really do think there have been some very radical changes that have been occurring and that are very well represented here in the way in which we think about our jobs as linguists. It's an ever-emerging, ever-changing phenomenon. And I think we need to be very aware of that. So we need to look back on older texts, older theories, and see where we've come from and where we're going, and differences that are not always as different as we think they might be. When you go back to some of the earlier theoretical works, if you go back to Sapir, if you go back even to Bloomfield, you will find many of the same stories. We might have forgotten them, but we're sometimes reinventing the wheel. So that's one set of responsibilities. We have responsibilities to teaching, making the study of English language and linguistics relevant in education. In the UK, there's a diploma on language, which is supposed to appear and be tested in high schools in Britain by 2011. We have a vice president for teaching, Jean Acheson, helping to promote English language and linguistics curricula in universities, colleges, and schools. And I asked Jean Acheson to be in touch with these people who are working on the UK diploma. They don't seem to have started yet. Very depressing. I mean, if I was a high school kid, I'd be worried. And we have responsibilities to the profession and the public, making the study of English language relevant to the public in general. And we have a vice president for the profession, Bas Arts, helping to promote public understanding of English language and linguistics worldwide. I was very interested last year when I went to Brazil to see the Museum of the Portuguese Languages in Sao Paulo. Fascinating museum, interactive. Talks about not only Brazilian Portuguese, but all the languages that contribute to the linguistic world of Brazil. And it turns out there's an English project supposed to come to fruition in 2012 in Winchester, England. And I've asked Bas Arts to be in touch with them, and he sent me this. You can see it on the website. This project will include all forms of English to reflect the amazing variety and power and adaptability of the language, from the street and workplace to science and advertising. There will be a core exhibition tracking the broad development of the language over the past 1,500 years across the globe, but it will be supplemented constantly by temporary exhibitions focused on special aspects and applications of English in, for example, pop music and science, law and love. Now, again, I think it's not our responsibility to run such a museum, but I do think that as linguists and as members of IEL, we have some responsibility to interact with them if we can, and to suggest ways in which they can make this particular project even more valuable than it might otherwise be. I want to end on a closing note. I've changed my metaphor from promontory to building the Tower of Babel. Babel, Babel, whichever you prefer. There was, as most of you probably know, a monk called Alfred who did a lot of work around the year 1000. And he wrote one of the first grammars of English, which, given one of my themes today is, interestingly, a comparison with Latin. Okay. So we have a very long history of comparative work. And I found online this really rather beautiful, I think, picture of the building of the Tower of Babel. I don't know, it doesn't come across very well in the color. It looks beautiful here on the computer. Not so beautiful there. But if you can decode it, this is building the tower. This is building it. There's nothing about the dissolution of languages. This is not the Tower of Babel that's falling apart and dissolving. And it struck me that we might think of this as what we're doing here at ISLE. We're building languages and varieties of languages, thinking about how they coexist. Because of the comparative work that is being done, this will make us understand similarities and differences between English and other languages of the world better, and the similarities and differences among the varieties of English that exist. And so we'll matching micro to macro analysis and understanding how the small individual bricks make up the whole. So I wish us all well in our tower building. Thank you.